I live in a small home in a fairly decent neighborhood, and I also work from home as well. I have my office set up upstairs in a small room, with my desk right by a window that faces the front of the house. I liked being able to open it for fresh air, or have the view when it was nice out. This was as fall was just starting, so I pretty much had the window open all day. One regular weekday though, around noon, I was doing my usual work at my desk when I noticed something out the window. There was a person, a man, standing at the bottom of my driveway, not walking past it or stopping to tie a shoe or anything. He was just standing there and looking up at my house. I couldn't tell if he could see me in the window or not, but after only a few seconds of me looking at him, he walked away. I thought it was really strange, but that was about it. What else was I supposed to think or do? I continued with work. I did an occasional check out the window every now and again, but seeing nothing else, I wasn't too worried about it. The following day, I was on the same routine. I got to work and was pretty busy the whole day. I had a lot of video calls with my coworkers. During one of these calls, I spaced out and happened to glance out the window again. That man was there, standing in the same spot at the end of the driveway and looking up at the house just like he was before. Something about this time was 10 times more creepy and eerie. Why the hell was he back here? I must have stared off at him for a while, because one of my coworkers noticed I looked worried and asked if everything was okay. I said yeah and tried to refocus on the meeting. I kept looking back though. He was standing there for a minute, then I looked back again and he was gone. The rest of my workday felt to drag on. I couldn't stop thinking about this random guy looking up at my house. It was just so odd. When I got out of work, I went outside and walked around my driveway, looking for any reason for them to be looking up at my house like that. Everything looked normal. However, I did notice that the window of my office was visible and clear from where the man was standing, which means he could likely see me looking at him. I went back inside and made dinner. I had a call with my brother that night, and I mentioned it. He agreed it was odd, but said it was likely nothing. After getting off the phone, I sat down and watched TV, hoping to get my mind off of it. A couple hours passed. It was maybe 9 p.m. I had the show turned down because I was getting tired, but with the low volume, I was able to hear what I thought were footsteps outside my house. I jolted up from the couch and stared at the front door. The footsteps walked up, only stopping for a brief second, then walked away. I hurried over to the door and looked out the peephole. I could only faintly see a figure walking down to the road. Once they were gone, I opened the door. Immediately, I noticed a note taped to the back. It was short. It just said, "Pat, answer the door." I was not only confused, but horrified. How did they know my name, and what was the note even supposed to mean? They didn't even knock or stay long enough for me to have answered the door. Not that I would have anyway. This was enough for me to call the police. 2 officers came over, and I told them everything. Unfortunately, there wasn't all that much they could do though. They pretty much wrote it all down and said if something else happens, call them. It really didn't make me feel much better. I stayed up late that night, laying in bed, unable to sleep. I literally just laid there for hours, thinking about this man that was stalking my house and the eerie note he left. Then, at just before 2 a.m., a knock at the front door echoed through the otherwise silent house. My body froze up. The silence of the house was now deafening as I listened in fear. After a few seconds, they knocked again. My heart started beating faster. I got my phone and called 911. They sent officers right away, but the knocks continued the whole time I waited. Eerily, they never got louder or more rushed or aggressive. It was just the same knocking, over and over, echoing through the hallways of my home. The operator on the phone updated me that the cops were 2 minutes out, and just after that, there was a longer pause between the knocking. 15 seconds, then 30, then a whole minute passed. When the officers showed up, nobody was at the door. They were too late. Again, I told them what happened, and they seemed to take it a little bit more seriously this time, but it still wasn't enough for them to do anything about it. They said they would have an officer patrol around here for the next couple weeks. Those weeks came and went, and the man never came back up to my door or to the end of the driveway, at least from what I know. It's been months later now, and still nothing else. It still scares the hell out of me though. The thought of the creepy note telling me to answer the door, and then there being knocking at 2 a.m. is just terrifying. Then there's also the thought of them coming back, lingering in my head. I don't know what they wanted, who they were, or if they're truly gone for good. This was when I was a freshman in high school. The town I lived in was small, and I guess you could say pretty old-fashioned compared to places nowadays. It was very woodsy all around, and the buildings and houses weren't so compacted together. My home was out in the woods. My parents had a decent amount of land, and my dad had built the place with his dad. Anyway, it didn't have a real road or a driveway. It was more of a dirt trail, so the school buses didn't have a stop at our place. I'd either have to walk a mile to my friend's house to get picked up, or just walk the extra distance straight to school. Usually, I just walk all the way to school. This was a typical day, as far as I could tell. I was walking down the trail from my home, enjoying the calm morning sounds of the woods, when I spotted a car up ahead. It wasn't my parents' car, or anyone else's that I knew, and it was just parked right on the trail. This trail only led to and from the house, so someone being on here was unusual. I don't know if I'd ever seen a random car here at all before this. I felt kind of uncomfortable having to pass it. There was a woman inside. She looked 35 or 40, with dark circles under her eyes and shaggy black hair. She glanced at me, but I just looked down. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked past, though. I picked up the pace and got to school. At the dinner table that night, I mentioned it to my parents, asking who it was and why they were there. Both of them looked worried and confused. They told me the woman must have just gotten lost, and I shouldn't worry about it, but I could see the worry in their eyes. They dropped me off at school for the next week, which was odd because they both started work early, like 6 a.m., so they must have called in late for the entire week just to drop me off. Honestly, I thought that it was an overreaction, as I felt I was old enough to handle myself, but I knew my parents were just being safe. On Monday morning of the following week, I packed up my book bag and started walking. During the last week that I'd been dropped off, we never saw the woman or the car, so I really wasn't worried at all anymore. However, this time, when I got to that same spot in the woods, she was there again, sitting in her car, watching me. I had a mini heart attack. This was too much to be a coincidence, showing up twice on the trail that was basically our driveway, sitting in the same spot, and only showing up when I was walking alone. I made the decision to cut through the woods instead of walking past her again. I took a few steps off the trail, but immediately the woman noticed. She turned her car on and drove up closer to me. I pretended to ignore her, walking faster into the woods. I heard her car door open and her footsteps crunching on the leaves behind me. But then she called out my name, like my full name, in this eerily calm and loving voice. I turned my head and looked at her. She had this dead stare and blank, expressionless face. Her eyes were tired and heavy, and she had this sickly look. I sprinted away, and after losing sight of her, I circled back through the woods to my house, where I called my parents. They called the police and came home right away. What I didn't expect was my parents to know exactly who the woman was. It was my dad's ex-wife from almost 2 decades ago. Apparently, she'd had mental health issues for a while and would have these horrifying episodes where she'd get obsessed with something and do disturbing things. The day I told them I saw her, my parents reported it to the police, knowing it had to be her. Police failed to do anything about it though, only checking up on her and saying she seemed normal. For that whole week though, she had been stalking our house, knowing that every time my parents left for work early, it meant I would be walking alone to school. My parents never told me what happened to her after this, or what she was trying to do to me, or why she was doing any of it. Hopefully, nothing like that happens again. This was in 2019. I worked at a grocery store, usually closing shifts, and I lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment. We had a lot of regulars at our store, customers that would come in all the time, and usually around the same time as well. One of these customers was a guy that came in right before closing a couple times a week. Nobody knew his name, but everybody knew of him because nobody liked customers that came in 10 minutes before the store closed. Usually being the only cashier, I'd be the one interacting with him. He was always a bit strange. He didn't talk much and always had a tired look on his face. This night, he came in as he always did, right before closing, grabbing a couple things and coming up to the register. I scanned everything, he paid, and he left. We didn't exchange any words aside from a simple greeting. 10 minutes later, I closed down the register and spent a few minutes cleaning up, clocking out and leaving at 10:15. As I walked out to my car, I noticed the man was still in the parking lot. He was standing awkwardly outside of his car with his hands at his side, just looking at the store. I got in my car and went home. I didn't have work the following day, so I stayed up a bit later than usual. I didn't get into bed until probably 1 a.m. Only moments after getting under the covers though, a bright light glared into my bedroom through one of the windows. I thought it was a neighbor pulling in, so I didn't really care about it. After a second, the light shut off, which unconsciously confirmed to me that it was just headlights. I fell asleep only a couple minutes later. I woke up in the night to what I thought was my phone ringing. The way I woke up, half asleep and in the middle of a dream, it was hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. I rubbed my eyes and tapped my phone on the nightstand. It was blank. No messages or phone calls came in. I wasn't sure what to think. I was going to just ignore it and go back to sleep, as I wasn't even fully awake yet to begin with. But the slightest thing caught my eye as I rolled back over. The bedroom door was barely cracked open, not even enough to let any light in or anything. It was just uneven with the door frame, not latched shut. I always closed the door to my room, so seeing it not fully shut immediately woke me up. I got out of bed and walked over, pushing it closed to see if maybe it was stuck for some reason. It smoothly latched into the door frame, just like it always did, so there was no way I'd mistakenly left it open. I felt my body get shaky. My heart was pounding. But even with everything pointing otherwise, I still tried to convince myself that this was somehow nothing. I tried to think of any possible way that this was something to not worry about, but my mind thought back to the light I saw before falling asleep. I walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was a car parked in my driveway. I could only see the back half of it, but I instantly felt a rush of panic. Who was at my house, and was someone inside with me? I hurried over to the door again and flicked on the lights. I stood there by the door, panicking and thinking, realizing I should call 911 just to be safe. I looked at the nightstand that my phone was on, and just before I started to walk over there, I saw an eye looking back at me from a crack in the closet. My body shook and I let out a gasp, then spun around and sprinted out of my house. By the time I found a neighbor that would answer their door and call the police for me, at least 15 minutes had gone by already. The car in my driveway was still there when officers showed up, but the man was gone. It didn't take long for them to use the car to track him down though, and I felt nauseous when it turned out to be the man from the grocery store. His reasonings for everything didn't make any sense, but it was clear he'd had his eye on me for a while now, and he was not mentally well. I think the only reason I'd woken up that night was because the man's phone rang while he was hiding, and he silenced it just as I woke up. If not for that, I don't know what would have happened to me, or if I'd even be here right now. I work at a really trashy bowling alley in my small town. It's one of those family-owned type places. Real small and not the best, but in our town it was a regular place a lot of people went to for some reason. I think it was because it was one of the only 24/7 places open for people to hang at. At least it used to be. This was in December. I had the dreaded 10 to 6 shift. It was almost always dead, and this night it was even more so. There was a huge snowstorm rolling through our town. From the time I clocked in and took over for the last shift, not a single customer was there. I spent 2 hours cleaning up all the lanes except for one, just in case a group happened to come in later. I checked out the windows. The parking lot was empty and snow was stacking up. I wasn't sure someone could even drive through the parking lot with all this snow unless a plow truck came through. After a bit, I pulled up a chair to the window and sat down, just looking out and resting, as there was nothing else to do. The place didn't have cameras, let alone anyone to watch them, so taking long breaks on slow days, or even sometimes sleeping, was easy to get away with. Another hour or so went by, when seemingly out of nowhere, there was a loud thud from behind the bowling lanes. I think I was half asleep when it happened, but I jolted up. I got off the chair and walked toward the back room. I really had no clue what that was. Maybe it had something to do with the snowstorm outside. The back room was where all the pins and bowling balls were stored, along with all the machines that run everything. It's basically a long hallway going the full length of the building. When I opened the door, it was completely dark. I didn't hear or see anything at first, until I looked down. There was water going down the hallway in a very clear footstep pattern. My face went pale. "Hello? Who's in here?" I started walking down, calling out a couple more times before I came across something taped to the wall. It was an envelope. In it were pictures, like Polaroids, of me working alone that night. There were some of me cleaning the lanes and just walking around, and one was disturbingly close to me as I was sitting by the window. It looked like they must have only been a few feet behind me. I felt like I was gonna faint. I ran back out the way I came and right to the front desk, dialing 911. I tried waiting for a minute, but the silence of the building and the unknowingness of what was going on just started to build up anxiety in me. I ended up running out to my car and waiting in there. Despite the weather, police actually got there really quick, like in 2 or 3 minutes. Whoever had been stalking me that night left no traces. Of course, the trashy place didn't have any cameras, so there was nothing else to go on. I don't know what that person was trying to do, or if it was just some sick joke, or what. Since then, I didn't have anything else happen. I quit a couple months after, though. I was driving alone from my friend's place all the way back home. He lived about an hour away at some really remote house. It was around 1 or 2 a.m. I can't remember exactly, but I was really tired and almost just wanted to sleep over at his place. I would have had to call off work though, which wasn't really an option. Because of where he lived, most of the drive was through large farmlands. I had some music playing to keep myself awake, and I just stared at the empty road ahead. About 20 minutes in though, my headlights lit up something right in the middle of the road. I slowed down, slamming on my brakes a bit harder than I had to. It was a suitcase, like a full, unopened suitcase, just standing up in the middle of the road. I probably stared at it for an odd amount of time because I was so tired and caught off guard by it. I decided to just go into the oncoming lane and go around it. I really wasn't in the mood to get out and move it or anything. It was definitely odd that it was standing upright like that, but it had to have just fallen out of someone's truck and happened to land like that. I couldn't think of any other reason. I kept driving, thinking about it for a little bit, but ultimately forgetting about it pretty quickly. Maybe 5 minutes passed. The roads were still quiet. I was just cruising along, but then again, something came up in my headlights. This time, it was a truck, parked in the middle of the lane. None of its lights or blinkers were on. If I didn't have my high beams on, this could have been dangerously close. I stopped behind them and waited for a second, then honked a few times. The truck didn't move at all. I didn't even see any movement inside of it through the back window. After waiting for 30 seconds, I started to slowly go around it. As I did, I noticed it had a few large dents and scrapes on the side. I couldn't tell if it was from a recent accident or not. It could have been one of those old trucks that just never repaired any of its parts. More concerning though, I didn't see anyone inside the truck. It was still dark looking through the windows, but I didn't see any shape or outline of anyone sitting in either the front or the back. I pulled further up and in front of it, getting back onto my side of the road, then slowed even more to look around. It was still just farmland in all directions. Why would someone park right there and leave their vehicle? There was nothing here. I felt strange about it, kind of creeped out honestly. I continued down the road. I just had a bad feeling about it, and I didn't want to stay too long to see it through. After that, I was definitely more awake. Was the suitcase and the truck somehow connected, or were they both just conveniently in the middle of the road? I never saw anyone on the side of the road going back to get the suitcase, so I don't know. But I only made it another minute before I was forced to stop for a third time. There was a person in the road. He was standing in my lane and waving his arms at me to stop. He looked early 40s and pretty disheveled. Messy hair, cuts and scrapes on his hands and arms, and overall just not in good shape. Once my tires stopped moving, he smiled and walked up to my window. "Hey, did you see a truck not too far back that way?" I said yes, I did. "Think you could give me a lift back there?" Before answering, I asked why it was parked in the road like that, and what he was doing out here, which I felt like given the circumstance, these were reasonable questions to ask. The man stumbled over his words for a second, before settling on saying he ran out of gas and was trying to walk to a gas station. But then, why would I drive him back to the truck? Wouldn't he have asked me to drive him to the gas station? He kept talking though, like he wasn't letting me think too hard about it. Now it was me stumbling over my words, trying to think of an excuse to say no, but my eyes wandered behind him and happened to see something sticking out of the crops on the side of the road. It looked like the tail end of a small car. It was deep into the crops. I could only see one of the rear headlights slightly reflecting the light from my car. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I knew whatever it was wasn't good. I rolled the window up, and the man instantly went from smiling to frowning. His eyes widened, and he started yelling and hitting the window. I pulled away and sped down the road. I got my phone out quickly after and called the cops. Reportedly, the truck was gone when they got there, but the car I saw in the crops was still there, and I guess the scene was far worse than I imagined. That was someone else's car, and the driver in it was no longer alive. Not from a crash, though. It seemed they likely picked up a hitchhiker, the guy I saw, and unfortunately, that was the last thing they ever did. It's assumed that the suitcase and the truck in the road had something to do with getting the car to pull over and pick him up. It's not for certain, though, but obviously the hitchhiker I saw was not telling the truth about his truck running out of gas. It all likely was just an act of violence by some crazy guy for no real reason, which makes it even more terrifying that I was that close to him, and he wanted me to let him in my car, just like the other guy had. The man was never identified. I was 16. I had just gotten a job at a pizza place about 6 months ago, and during that time, I saved up enough to buy a cheap car. I hated not being able to drive myself, but also I wanted to do deliveries instead of working inside the shop. It was a regular weeknight. I got in after school at 5 and was scheduled until 10:30. It was busy for the first couple hours, but by 8 it abruptly slowed down. There wasn't another delivery to be made until 9. It was an online order for just 2 medium pizzas. I picked it up and started driving. It wasn't busy out, just a few cars here and there. But once I got about 5 minutes out from the neighborhood, a car pulled onto the road from a side street and came up behind me. The roads were empty, and they could have easily passed me if they wanted to, but they stayed right behind me. I didn't really think about it. I mean, to be honest, I didn't care at all at the time. Throughout the next 5 minutes, they stayed right behind me. When I took the turn into the neighborhood, I looked in my mirror. After a few seconds, their headlights appeared, turning down the road. That's a pretty big coincidence. What were the chances that the only other car on the road was going to the same small neighborhood as me? I guess it was very possible, but it got me feeling a little more aware of the situation. I kept driving. This street was through the woods, with individual houses spread out on either side of the road. Some were right up on the road, and some were down longer driveways. As I got deeper into the neighborhood, finally my headlights lit up a mailbox that had the right address on it. I turned into the driveway. I checked my mirrors again, and a few seconds later, the car passed right by and continued down the road. I remember feeling relieved and silly for thinking anything of it. I drove to the end of the driveway. It wasn't too long, maybe like 200 feet or something. I pulled up and got out with the pizzas. I gave the door a couple knocks. Nobody answered the door for a minute, and while the porch light was on, it didn't look like any of the inside lights were on. I knocked again. About 30 seconds passed. Then a light shined through the window, and a few seconds later, a woman answered the door. She looked like she was in her early 30s and was wearing a nightgown, and she looked really tired. Immediately, something about this felt wrong. I had these pizzas ordered to this address. I then read out the address to her, but she looked annoyed. The woman said she didn't order anything and was trying to sleep. She was definitely a little cranky, but it was clear there was some kind of mistake. I apologized and walked off the porch. I was kind of spaced out for a moment, looking at the ground, thinking about how weird this was as I walked back to my car. But about halfway there, I looked up and felt a chill rush through me. There was a car sitting right behind mine. It was the same one that I thought was following me. Its headlights were off, but I could see the fog coming from the exhaust, so the car was still on. I felt really uncomfortable. Did they also live here with the woman and were just pulling in? Or did it have something to do with the order? Everything just felt really off, like too coincidental. I knew something was wrong. I continued walking to my car, hoping they would see me and either say something or move. I got in and tossed the pizzas on the passenger seat and turned my car on, but they stayed there. The driveway was thin. There wasn't really any space to go around them, but I pulled further up toward the house and turned around. Surely they would see that I was trying to leave now. They still remained right in the middle of the driveway, blocking the exit. There was about 30 seconds as I faced their car and they faced me, and we both just sat there. During that time, I kind of put everything together. Them driving behind me, following me into the neighborhood, and the creepy, sudden appearance of them blocking the driveway. None of this was a coincidence. I felt my body start to go numb as my heart started pumping in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Then, their car doors opened. 4 men got out. They all had hoodies and hats on, covering pretty much their whole faces. One of them had their hand suspiciously tucked into his hoodie pocket, like he was holding on to something. They started running up to my car, and I panicked. I hit the gas, trying to go around them and past their car, but there wasn't enough room. The wheels went off the driveway, and I skidded in the dirt, ramming into a tree. It was a pretty slow hit. The airbags didn't even go off or anything, and I don't think the car was stuck. But I didn't take any chances. I jumped out and started running. I heard one of them chasing me and yelling to the others, but they turned back after a little bit. When I was safe, I stayed in the woods and called 911. When the officers got to the home, all of the men and both cars were gone. My car was never recovered, even to this day. What essentially happened was the group used some random address to lure me into by ordering a pizza, hoping to trap me in. What they were going to do with me is unknown. The fact that one of them chased me makes me think they didn't plan on letting me go. I got lucky that night. I was driving home from work. It was snowing out. Nothing crazy, but enough to be driving slower and more carefully. It was also pretty cold out, freezing temperatures for sure. I got out of the office late this night, probably sometime around 1 or 2 a.m. The roads were quiet and deserted. Along my route, I pulled up to an intersection. It was a red light, although no other cars were anywhere to be seen. I waited, thinking about how much I wanted to sleep when I get home, when all of a sudden there was a knock against my truck. I jumped back in my seat and darted my eyes to the passenger window. It was a woman. I had no idea where she came from, but she was knocking on my window and looking right at me. I rolled it down. She looked young, maybe in her late 20s, and her face looked cold and pale. She apologized and said she really didn't want to bother anyone, but her car broke down a mile back and she tried to walk home, only to find out how freezing cold it was. She wanted a ride, saying it was only another mile down this road. Feeling bad for her, I let her in. Maybe it was because of the way she said everything, or just because she looked like an innocent woman, but I believed her story, and it was freezing outside, and she did look cold. I started driving as she repeatedly thanked me. A couple minutes later, she told me to turn down into a neighborhood. Now, I did pass by this place every day on my commute to work, but I'd never actually been through any of these neighborhoods or knew anything about them. Turning in, though, it was clear this wasn't a nice place. The houses were extremely small, old, and outdated, looking almost like trailer homes lined up next to each other. I only got a bit down the road before my truck started having trouble. The street wasn't plowed yet, and it looked even worse further down. As we got deeper into the back of the neighborhood, I slowed to a stop and asked if this was an okay spot for her to get out. When I looked at her, though, her face was frowned until she noticed me looking. She smiled and politely asked if I could go a little bit further. I hesitated to answer. She asked again, a little less nicely. I explained to her that I didn't want to risk getting my truck stuck down there, but she still insisted, trying to guilt trip me. Finally, I just said no and told her to get out. She looked angry, but opened the door and got out. I thought that was really strange, considering how I went out of my way to help her. But I started to do a 3-point turn, and when my headlights shined into the side facing the houses, I saw something. People standing further back near the tree line, which was also where the woman was toward. They were just a little bit down the road, right where the woman was trying to get me to go. I hurried up and got out of there. I don't know what kind of situation I got myself into that night, but I think it was really close to getting a lot worse. Had I gotten stuck out there, or even just driven a bit further up, who knows what they would have done. I'm 32 and work for a trucking company. This was around the holidays. The roads weren't too bad for the most part, but driving in winter was always a little bit more tiring. This day, or night rather, was normal. I left town at 6 p.m. to deliver a load 2 states away. At about 11 p.m., I made my first stop. I pulled into a small truck stop on the side of the road, just to use the bathroom and grab a coffee, and maybe rest my eyes for a little bit. I parked and went into the building, then came back out with my coffee and hopped back into the driver's seat. I took a moment to myself and just sat there, taking a few sips and looking around. Only a couple other trucks were in the parking lot. Guess it was a quiet night. As I sat there, I happened to spot someone at the back of the building. The lights were dim back there, but some guy was leaning against the wall and looking out in my direction. I couldn't see his eyes, but my truck was the only one parked over here. There was nothing else to look at. I minded my own business and just kept sipping my coffee, but every time I looked back, the guy was still looking over here. I was sure it was nothing, but it still felt too weird for me to get any shut-eye. Snow was starting to come down as well. I put my drink in the cup holder and started up the truck, then pulled out and began the next section of the drive. The coffee definitely kicked in, keeping my eyes open. The roads were completely empty. About 30-ish minutes down the road, a light glimmered in my side mirror for just a moment, like a glint reflecting off of something behind my trailer. I kept checking my mirrors, thinking it was a car coming up, but there was nothing behind me that I could see. Maybe it was a broken reflector on the road or something. I didn't know. The snow was beginning to pile up a bit on the road though, so for the next while I was more focused on what was ahead of me, making sure I made it in one piece. I think a good hour or so went by. Focusing on the road was getting more exhausting with every minute. But then again, there was a quick glint in my side mirror. I only barely shifted my eyes quick enough to catch what it was. There was a car right behind my trailer, like so close that it was completely covered in my mirrors. Its headlights were off too, so only when it was slightly off to the side did my headlights reflect onto theirs, creating that little glint I was seeing. I was no stranger to having people tailgating me for going slow, but this was really strange though, in this weather, being that close to me and with no headlights. What were they doing? After a minute or two of thinking about it, I thought it best to get away from them, or at least keep them off my tail, for both of our safety. I merged into the other lane, but the car followed. Confused, I merged back into the right lane. This time I think they got the hint that I was on to them, and they stayed on their side. They started to slow down though, and eventually they fell out of sight. I didn't have a clue what they were doing, but at least they were off my back. I drove on the quiet road through the snow for another 2 hours. It was around 3 a.m., and I decided to pull off at a rest stop to get a few hours of shut-eye. It was just one of those little cutaways off the road that could fit maybe 2 or 3 semis. There was no building or restrooms, it was just a parking area. I parked, cut off the engine, leaned my chair all the way back, and closed my eyes. I dozed off pretty fast. I was used to being limited on sleep, so every minute counts. The calm winds and snow trickling down definitely helped though. I planned to wake up whenever the sun came up, so like 3-ish hours, but I woke up before that. I slowly opened my eyes, seeing the dark truck cabin and the faint highway lights in front of me. I was still really tired. I didn't know why I woke up. After a second, I rolled my body over to reposition myself, but was instantly met with the eyes of something outside my window. They were staring in at me with disturbingly wide, creepy eyes. I almost fell out of my seat, but the guy didn't even flinch. He just stepped down and tried to open the door, but after a few tries, I heard his footsteps rushing away in the snow. I used the radio to call for help, and moments later, a car drove out from behind my truck. It was the same one that was on the road before. I gave as much of a description as I could, and it was as the officers asked me to go over everything that happened that night that I remembered the man I saw watching me at the truck stop. Maybe it was him this whole time. But why was he stalking me, and what was he trying to do? I never found out.
Life is truly filled with horror stories. These traumatic events leave many people with severe and life-altering injuries, but even after the trauma, the struggle isn't over. Have you ever thought about what you would do after you got injured? If you had medical bills to pay but no ability to work? How would you know that your insurance companies or the people responsible for your injuries are being fair to you? Then, trying to navigate the situation with traditional law firms can be a daunting, confusing ordeal that brings even more pain. The piles of paperwork, the hours of your valuable time used up, and the expensive fees hitting you while you're already down. With Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm, that won't be a problem. When you're seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. Morgan & Morgan don't accept lowball settlements from insurance companies. In recent months, they've achieved massive victories for victims of serious car crashes. In Florida, they achieved a verdict for $12 million, which was 34 times greater than the highest insurance offer. In Philadelphia, they achieved a verdict for a $26 million payout, 40 times more than the highest settlement offered by the insurance company. Morgan & Morgan will fight for you to get the best outcome if you become their client. If you hire Morgan & Morgan, you won't just be assigned a single lawyer, but an entire dedicated legal team with lawyers, case investigators, paralegals, and customer care specialists, all working to maximize your settlement. On top of that, there are thousands of support staff available at all hours to help you with any questions or concerns about your case, making the experience as painless as possible. The best part is, you don't pay them a penny unless you win your case. And Morgan & Morgan didn't become the largest injury law firm for no reason. It's because they win a lot. Even better, they've modernized the injury law process, so it only takes minutes to see if you have a case, and you can submit your claim on your phone. If you ever get seriously injured, your case could be worth millions, and you're only a few clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's easy. You can start your claim with Morgan & Morgan at www.forthepeople.com/MJV, found in the description below, or by scanning the QR code on screen with your phone's camera. You can type in your name, phone number, zip code, and email address, select the type of your claim, then describe what happened. Click or tap Start Your Claim and you're done. Remember, Morgan & Morgan is the largest injury law firm in the United States, so they have all the resources and know-how to see your case through. There's no company too big for Morgan & Morgan to fight, and they'll fight for you to get the settlement you deserve if you become their client.
I was working DoorDash this night. It was pretty late, like 12 or 1 a.m. I was used to staying up, so doing these late night deliveries was kind of normal for me. This night was slow. I was driving around and just listening to music while waiting for any orders to come through. When one finally did, I barely even looked at the details before accepting it, since I didn't have much options anyway. I drove up to the 24/7 McDonald's and picked up their order, then had the app set me on course for the drop-off location. It was 15 minutes from me. The whole drive was quiet. The roads were still, and I didn't really have any thoughts. I was just going through the motions. When I was a minute from arriving, it had me turn into I don't know what to call it. I guess it was a business area, but it didn't look like a regular one. Usually these places with a bunch of business buildings were nice, like well landscaped and taken care of, but this place wasn't. Most of the buildings looked old and unused, and the grass and bushes around them were overgrown and untrimmed. It was strange. The map had me turn into a parking lot where a small office building was. It looked like it was only one story and was just as old and out of shape as the other places. I had done deliveries to office buildings before, or people at work, so this was nothing out of the ordinary, really. It was just the strange nature of this area that had me put off. The map had me pull into what looked like the back of the building, though it was kind of hard to tell. I looked at the directions to see if maybe there was more info, but then a message popped up from the customer. They said they saw me pull in and to bring it up to the gray metal door on my side of the building. I said alright and pulled up next to the building, then got out with the bag. As I walked up to it, I could tell this was definitely the back of the office. There was no main door, it was just a bunch of random doors, like a fire exit door and a bunch of back access doors. I found the one they were talking about though. It was a gray metal door with no windows or markings or anything. As I approached it, my phone got another message. He just said to bring it right inside for him. I kinda just shrugged it off and did as he said, not thinking too hard about it. I opened the door and stepped in. It was a hallway, but the main lights weren't on. It was just what I guess were the low energy lights. Small, dim light bulbs spread out down the hallway. Honestly, I was expecting some sort of room, or like a counter or something, that would be an obvious place for me to put the food. Was I supposed to just walk further into the building, or was he gonna meet me here? I pulled my phone back out to text him when I heard a click behind me. I turned and looked at the door. I pulled on the handle, but it was stuck. Someone just locked me in. All the blood rushed from my face. What did I just get myself into? I dropped the bag and tried harder to open the door, but it didn't budge at all. My only option was to go further down the hallway and hope I could find another way out before whoever was out there finds their way to me. Just as I started making my way down the hallway, I heard a door open and close from somewhere on the other side of the building. I hurried, running to the end and finding another door. When I opened it, there was another dimly lit hallway with a bunch of rooms on either side. I went in, but immediately heard something from the other end, so I made a split-second decision and slipped into one of the office rooms and hid. A few seconds later, footsteps came rushing through the hall and right up to the door to the hallway I just came from. They went in, running down toward the locked door. I made a run for it, going the direction the person came from and hoping to find the exit. Thankfully, I did. I ran back out to my car and drove out of there. Unfortunately, I don't think the officer on the phone understood the situation fully because they didn't get an officer there for 20 minutes. Nobody was there by then. However, I was informed that the office building was not in service at the moment, or hadn't been for the last 5 or so years. It was like partially abandoned, I guess. No cameras or anything. What exactly would have happened if I hadn't been quick enough to leave that hallway? Who knows? Definitely won't let myself get in a situation like that again, though. I used to do deliveries as kind of a side gig in my 20s. It's been a while since then, but I always remembered this one incident that happened during that time. This night, an order was put in at our restaurant at 9, and I went to drop it off around 9:20. I had no reason to believe this was anything other than a regular delivery order. The only slight difference was that it was a little bit farther than usual, being 20 minutes away. It was also 20 minutes in the other direction of most of the residential areas of our town. Our shop was near the edge, so this was just going into what I thought was a pretty barren area outside of town. Regardless, the address looked like it was just any other home address. I followed the directions, getting on to the highway. This wasn't like the typical huge 4-lane highways. It was just a 1-lane road that led from our town through the forest into the next town over. Everyone still called it the highway though. I knew there were some older neighborhoods and houses off this road, so I figured it was going to be one of them. I drove on that road for 15 minutes. It was pretty dead out there at that time of night. When the directions came to an end though, I was taken aback. It didn't tell me to turn anywhere. It just stopped at a seemingly random point in the road and said my destination was on the right. I pulled off to the side, at least to just figure out what was going on. I tried searching up the address on Google Maps, and then on Apple Maps, and both of them led to exactly where I was on the road. I thought maybe I was missing something. I rolled down the window and looked out at the side of the road, but all I saw were trees. It looked like a forest and nothing else. No dirt driveways, or lights, or anything. I decided to just call the customer and ask where the hell his house was, or if there even was a house, because honestly, part of me was thinking this was some kind of joke. The phone rang, and I put it up to my ear as I continued looking out at the forest. Only a second later, a light suddenly glowed from out in the trees. It wasn't bright, but still noticeable in the pitch-black woods. It went out after a moment though, and before I could think about it too much, a voice came through the phone asking who was calling. "Hey, I got this order here, but I think we have the wrong address." He asked me where I was, and I described the area to him. Oddly, his response was that it sounded like I was in the right place. He said there was a small driveway going into the woods. I told him I didn't see it, but he said it was hard to find and that I might have to get out to look for it. I sighed and said alright, then got out and walked to the other side of my car. I started asking which direction I should look, but he suddenly hung up on me. I thought that was pretty weird. But it was even more strange when I looked up and saw that glowing light in the forest again. It shut off after only a second. What the hell? That had to be the guy I was just talking to on the phone. Why was he just standing out there and not coming up to the road? And if he was out there, then why wasn't I seeing a driveway going in that direction? I looked back down, and I guess I saw what he was talking about. There was an extremely thin, rugged dirt line going into the woods. I say line because that's basically all it was. Definitely not a driveway. It looked like it was scrappily carved with a small shovel or something. There was no way in hell I was going to walk down that and into the forest, especially not with whatever was going on with the guy out there. I set the food on the ground, right on the side of the road. As I did, I started to hear leaves rustling from the bushes out in the forest. I hurried up and got in my car, then bailed out of there. Thankfully, I wasn't dumb enough to listen to the man on the phone and go into the woods. Something was wrong. I could feel it, but I didn't have anything to really prove it. What could have happened that night, I'll never know. I used to work for Domino's. I only had the job for a couple of months, but for the most part, I didn't find it to be too bad. I ran pizzas back and forth from the shop and made extra from tips. This night, I got in at 8. Our store was always open until 12, and we got a surprising amount of orders that late, too. Like, we stayed steady throughout the night, all the way up until closing. This order came in toward the end of the night. I want to say around 11 or so. I was just running through the orders one after the other, so I grabbed this one and started heading down the road. It was in a direction I wasn't as familiar with, just because most of the orders came from the same general area. This one took me to the more spread out and woodsy part of town. I always thought this was where the rich people had their isolated mansions hidden in the trees, but at night, it didn't look like much of anything was out there. I drove until the directions told me to turn down a gravel road. It was wide and had lamps on the sides, guiding me down the whole way, and at the end it split off into 5 smaller paths, too thin for a car to fit down. There was a sign there that said something like, "Welcome to the Frosted Oak Cabins." It was a cabin rental property. I looked back at the address that was on the order, and it said Cabin 3 at the end. I looked at the signs next to each path and found one that led to Cabin 3. These paths had dimmer and smaller lamps going along them, so I couldn't see down very far. I had no idea how long I was going to have to walk for. I parked the car and picked up the pizzas, then began walking. The dim lamps felt even worse as I got further in, because I almost couldn't see anything until I was right up next to one. So I'd be in the light for a few seconds, then walk blindly to the next one for a minute. I was worried I'd drop the food or trip on something. The woods were pretty calm though, just the sound of crickets and the leaves rustling in the wind. I think I walked for 3 or 4 minutes, though it felt like longer, before I made it to the last lamp and the end of the path. There was a little opening in a very small cabin in the middle. It had a window on the front, and oddly there was no light coming from it. The cabin was dark. I walked up and knocked on the door. I could hear the knock echo inside the cabin, but there wasn't the slightest sound in return. I pulled my phone out and called the number on the order. It rang for a whole minute and ended without anyone answering. I wasn't sure exactly what to do. I didn't want to walk all the way back for nothing. I looked out at the woods as I stood there, thinking about what else to do. Then I got a text. It was from the same number I just called. The text read, "I'm not at the cabin right now. The door is unlocked. Please leave the pizzas on the table inside. Thanks. I turned and faced the door again, then twisted the handle. I pushed the door open just a little bit. I know they told me to, but it still felt kind of wrong. All the lights were off, and it was extremely dark. Hello? Is anyone home? With no reply, I pushed the door further open and took a few steps inside. It looked like just one long, open room, and maybe a small bedroom at the end. I went over to the table and started setting down the food when I heard a creak. My eyes shot over to the bedroom door, not getting to even think before it suddenly opened. I almost had a heart attack. I thought nobody was home. A man appeared in the doorway and started walking toward me as I nervously stuttered over my words. The man tried to tell me he had my tip and was thanking me for bringing it inside, but he was walking aggressively fast toward me. I backed up as he got just a couple feet away. He jumped forward, trying to grab me as his face shifted into rage. I ran out the front door, but instantly slammed into someone else. He fell in the grass, and I caught myself from falling, sprinting back to the path. I heard both of them chase after me, but every time I glanced back, they weren't within the light of any of the lamps. I made it to my car and sped out before they ever caught up to me. I called the police. Both men were gone, of course, but I was hoping that with the order, phone number, and cabin rental, they'd easily be able to identify them. However, they couldn't. They broke into the unrented cabin, used a fake phone number, and paid online with a Visa gift card. There was nothing to identify them with. Thinking back on what happened is almost more terrifying. Obviously, it was their plan to get me out there and into the cabin so they could trap me inside. But the other guy came out of nowhere. Was he out there in the woods, watching me the whole time, waiting for me to go in? Had he been just a moment faster, they would have succeeded, and I don't know what they would have done. I'm 23 and in college. This was about a month ago, when winter was just starting. During our college's winter break, I spent most of my free time doing DoorDash just to make a quick buck. This day I did a few hours earlier, but later on in the night I got bored again and decided to go out for another few orders. It was around 9 p.m. I picked up a big order, like 2 full bags of food, then started heading to the address. It was in a neighborhood I'd never been to before. It took me through it, down a long winding road of normal houses, and all the way to the back of the neighborhood. It looked like a dead-end road, but the directions said it was straight ahead. As I pulled closer to the end, my headlights lit up a small wooden gate with numbers on it. It matched the address to my delivery order. It was strange though. None of the other houses had gates, and were all just along the street. Yet this one seemed to be down a long personal driveway. I got out and opened the gate. It didn't have a lock or anything. I just pushed it open. I got back in the car and drove down this wide gravel road through some trees before reaching a single house at the end. It was definitely older than all the others, all wooden and kind of small. It was exactly where the GPS said it should be though. I got out with the order. I left my car on, so my headlights were lighting up the front of the house, but I noticed none of their lights were on, like not a single one. Yet the front door was wide open. When I got up to the porch, I could hear just how quiet it was inside. Such a big order, and yet it was like nobody was home. Wasn't my concern though. I started putting the bags down when a voice called out from somewhere upstairs. "Hey, just bring it up here for me, bud." There was a staircase right by the entrance, but it was so dark inside I couldn't see the top of the stairs. Stupidly, I took a couple steps inside. "Attaboy, I'll grab it from ya, right up here." His voice came from right at the top, in that pocket of darkness that I couldn't see anything in. The eerie stillness and silence of the house made me increasingly more unsettled. As I approached the steps, I snapped out of it and backed out. I dropped the food on the porch on my way out and ran back to my car. I didn't know what to do after that, so I just went home and told nobody about it. A few days later, though, I looked up the address, and sure enough, it wasn't supposed to be occupied. It was an abandoned house owned by the state. What was waiting for me at the top of those stairs is something I'm glad to never know. Me and my older brother, Cameron, were doing a camping trip on the East Coast. Cameron chose the site and everything, like he usually did, and I just tagged along. He chose well, though. The campsite was really nice, and since we had to hike to get there, it wasn't crowded. There was nobody around, from what we could see. The campsite wasn't very defined, though. It was hard to tell if we were even in the right spot. There were several openings in the trees that looked like they could have been the place we were supposed to be at, but neither of us thought it mattered. We set up on one of the grassy openings, and while we initially thought this place wasn't very active, we started to notice we were wrong. There were leftover things scattered around. Nothing big, like entire tents or anything, but just small things, like a trekking pole or some old shoes. It wasn't normal for these things to be left behind, though, not at campsites like this that were far out. We both thought it was weird, but we went on with our day. We didn't really do much, just hung out and talked. When it got darker out, we lit up a fire and sat around it. A couple hours into the night, I happened to spot something behind Cameron. I pointed it out, not sure what it was. Both of us looked, and after a few moments, we were able to tell that it was a small campfire. It was really far out, and partially blocked by all the trees, but the tiny orange flame was flickering in the distance. Had it not been for the moonlight being covered by the clouds and the absolute darkness of the woods, there was no way we would have been able to notice it. I guess we weren't alone, though. It was a little odd that they were out in that direction, because it seemed like it was just forest over there. No openings or anything to really set up a campsite. Maybe they wanted to be away from other people or something. We didn't think about it too much. We got some snacks and drinks out and talked ourselves into exhaustion. We put out the fire and went to bed around midnight. I fell asleep pretty comfortably, not having any trouble at all, though I woke up at some point in the night. It must have only been an hour or two after I'd gone to sleep. I knew exactly why I'd woken up, though. I drank a bit too much right before bed. Needing to relieve myself, I got up and unzipped the tent. I walked out maybe 50 feet from the campsite to make sure I didn't attract any animals, and did my business. But as I was out there, I noticed the flame way out in the forest was still lit up. Maybe it was because I was tired, or just out of it for some reason, but I stood there and stared at it for a minute. I don't even know why, but my eyes began adjusting to the dark as I stood there. And as I looked out into the woods, I suddenly noticed something else. It looked like a figure somewhere far out between me and the distant flame I was looking at. I felt a shock for a moment, but I told myself it couldn't actually be a person and had to be a weird-looking bush or something. Like there was no way someone was out in the dark outside our camp at this time of night. But I kept looking, trying to make out what I could, when I started to notice more of these figure-looking shadows in the woods. They were so far, and it was so dark, I couldn't tell if my mind was just playing tricks on me. If they were people, though, there were at least 10 or 15 of them, and they seemed to all be looking right at me. Another shock ran through me. What the hell is this? I almost thought I was hallucinating. I turned around and hurried back to the tent. I debated for a second whether to wake Cameron up. I knew if it was nothing, I would never hear the end of it, but my gut was telling me otherwise. I opened his tent and shook him awake. He was really confused at first, but I just told him I thought I saw something and wanted a second opinion. He hesitantly got up, and I started to lead him out to where I was, but we didn't get very far. The figures I had seen had moved. They were closer, standing all spread out among the trees. I really hoped at this point I was just seeing things, but I slowly looked back at Cameron and could see the pale, fear-covered expression on his face, his eyes wide open. He saw what I saw. I looked back out, and it was more apparent than ever that these were people. I could see their subtle movements as they stood there and watched us. We backed up towards our tents. Should we leave? I can still vividly remember Cameron's shaky voice as he spoke those words. He was always so confident and sure of what to do. It was terrifying seeing and hearing him like that. I nodded, and neither of us grabbed any of our stuff aside from the car keys and our wallets. We hurried away and down the trail. It seemed that they didn't follow us. We reported what happened to the police, feeling it was necessary. They didn't take it too seriously though, very clearly thinking we were crazy. Like there was no way a whole group of people were out in the woods at night messing with us. We thought about the strange amount of left behind things we saw in the area and had hoped others had already gone to the police about similar encounters, but nobody had. There were no official accounts of anything happening there. Maybe they just went unreported. Or maybe nobody ever made it back to report it. This happened a while ago. I want to say 2014. I live in a pretty woodsy town, like with lots of forest around it, and plenty of small campgrounds within an hour or so. I had a 4-day weekend off from work, and I hadn't gotten out in a while, so I decided to head to one of these campgrounds for a laid-back weekend camping trip. The campground I chose was a small one, where you park in a small dirt area and choose one of the 3 sites they had to set up your tent at. There were already fire pits set up, and even some grills and benches. They looked awful, but I guess some people still use them. All 3 spots were open though, and no other cars were there, so I just chose the one on the far left and put all my things over there. The walk from my truck to the campsite was only about 5 minutes, but the area was very densely covered in trees, so it still felt like I was fully in the woods. Plus, the actual camping ground was about 45 minutes from town as well. It was about an hour in that I realized I had no idea what to do. Like, should I just sit here and relax, or read a book? I didn't really know. I thought maybe there was a trail or something I could walk on, so I went back to where the entrance was to see if there was anything. There wasn't, but there was another car next to mine now. It was an old red Toyota, like really old, rusted all around, and with dents and scratches all over. And one really strange thing I noticed about it was it didn't have a license plate on either the front or the back. I didn't really know what to think, but I figured they must have been camping at one of the other spots. With no trail though, I went back to my campsite and just sat on a log. After only 10 minutes, I heard footsteps coming up behind me. I looked back. There was a guy walking down the trail. He had no backpack or anything, and he was looking right at me, like he was coming down just to talk to me or ask me something. The man looked like he was in his 30s, but he almost looked older because of how he was put together, or rather, not put together. His brown jacket had holes all over it and was covered in stains, and his beard and hair were oily and shaggy.
You wouldn't happen to be able to help me with something real quick, would ya?
He asked. Having nothing to do, I said sure and stood up, but he quickly said thank you and that he was just asking for now. He still had some things to do first, but he was going to come back in a little bit and get me when he needed a hand. I said okay, and he thanked me again, then walked away. I wasn't too sure why he came by if he didn't need me right now, but I figured he probably just had to unpack his car first and would be back in 10 or 15 minutes. I sat and waited, but a half hour passed, and then another. By then the sun was going down, and I thought he must have gotten it done himself, whatever it was. 2 hours later, I'd completely forgotten about it. I had the fire pit lit up and was making my dinner when I heard footsteps behind me again. I looked back, but this time it was eerily dark. I could hear his footsteps coming down the trail, but he was completely covered in darkness. I couldn't even see his silhouette. I listened to the crunching steps against the gravel slowly make their way into the light of my campfire. It was the same man, just as I thought. I didn't understand why he came back, though. It was so late now.
Hey, you ready? Just need a little help still. With what?
He noticed my hesitation.
It'll only take a minute. You aren't busy by the looks of it.
He said jokingly, with a smile, but it felt odd, like he was being pushy. He also avoided my question. My social awkwardness kind of failed me here, though, because I nervously agreed, knowing I really had nothing else to do, and it was obvious. He smiled again and started leading the way. As we got further from my campfire, it got way darker, and I realized how odd it was that he walked here without a flashlight. It also felt strange following him into the dark.
Hey, so what was it you needed my help for?
I asked. He slowed down for a split second, like he was going to say something, but then he continued walking and didn't answer. I felt my heart rate spiking. My body knew something was wrong. Suddenly, the silence of the forest around me felt disturbingly eerie, like a calm before the storm. I began slowing down, trying to put some distance between us without it being too obvious. I only managed to get a few feet away before he turned around and looked at me. He had a creepy fake smile that immediately shifted into a frown when he saw me further away. He stopped walking, and so did I. Before I could say anything, I saw his hand reach down into his jacket, and I immediately turned and sprinted deeper into the woods after just seeing the handle of what I could only assume was a knife. I could hear his footsteps pounding against the ground and his heavy breathing as he chased me through the dark for probably a good 2 minutes. He started slowing down, and eventually it was just the sound of me running through the woods. Luckily, I had my phone and keys on me, so I called 911. When they got to the camping grounds, only my truck was there. The red car was gone, and so was the man. I described everything for them, as both the car and the man had such a distinct look, but that information wasn't enough. I think it's pretty clear what was about to happen that night, but there doesn't seem to be any reason why, aside from the fact that I was camping alone. The way the man waited until night to try it, and how he came by during the day so that I'd be more likely to follow him later, is terrifyingly manipulative. I'm worried others may fall victim to it, or possibly already have. This was 2 years ago, in the middle of spring. I had taken time off work to go camping at a small lake in northern Minnesota. It was a place I'd been to a couple of times, with friends or family that decided to join me, but this time it was just me. The hike to get there took about 2 hours, but it wasn't too rigorous, mostly just flat trail all the way there. I set up my tent and other things a bit into the woods so as to not be right up against the lake. Then I unfolded my chair, popped open a beer, and listened to the calm sounds of the water and the birds chirping. It was already late into the day, so I didn't have much time before the sun started going down. I always enjoyed nighttime in the woods though. It was always so quiet and almost felt freeing in a way. I don't know how else to describe it. However, this night was different. Once the sun went down, I built up a campfire and continued relaxing. Yet, this feeling came over me that usually didn't happen. I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking around at the trees and the darkness that surrounded me, having this uneasy, almost paranoid feeling. I was never like this, so I wasn't sure what was going on. Every time I looked around though, I didn't see anything at all. The problem was that it was so dark, I'm not sure I would have been able to see anything, even if there was something, or someone out there watching me. Of course, with no real reason to feel the way I did my best to suppress the thoughts and try to ease my mind away from it. Eventually, I was able to distract myself by thinking about some personal stuff I had going on in my life. It wasn't a fun distraction, but I guess it was better than being paranoid. Hours passed. I want to say it was about 10 or 11 by this point, when there was a very sudden and loud crack in front of me, like a large stick snapping under heavy weight from somewhere right ahead of me. It was pitch black out there. I couldn't see anything. The sound was so loud though, it echoed across the woods. A shiver ran through me. It sounded like something heavy stepping on a branch. Was it a large animal, or was it a person? I wasn't sure which I was more afraid of. I pulled out my bear spray, then called out.
Hello? Someone out there?
There was not even the slightest sound in response to my voice. I couldn't help but feel like if it were a large animal, I would have heard them walking around, brushing up against the bushes and crunching the leaves. I kind of just sat there for a minute, staring out into the dark and waiting to see or hear something, before I'd remembered I'd brought a flashlight with me. I dug through my backpack and grabbed it, but by then it had already been a minute or two, and when I shined it out there, it was empty. Nothing out there at all. Obviously, I was starting to feel paranoid again, but this time it felt justified. I quickly tended to the fire, adding in some more wood to make sure it didn't burn out and stayed bright enough to light up my campsite. Every couple minutes, I turned my flashlight back on and just scanned the area. Then, one time I turned it on, I immediately saw something at the far end of the light. It was a person, definitely a man. They were freakishly tall, not like inhuman or anything, but maybe like 6'5". They instantly moved out of the light, going further back where the light couldn't reach. My adrenaline was pumping. Had my gut feeling been right this whole time? I thought back to the sound I heard earlier and how it sounded like something large, enough to make such a loud crack sound. The guy I saw was huge. At that height, he was probably 250 pounds at least. It had to have been him, which means he was out there watching me for who knows how long. I panicked, taking down my tent and shoving my belongings into my backpack. I knew which way he ran from the light, so I ran off in the opposite direction, which also happened to be back toward my car. After a while, I felt safe enough to turn on my flashlight on the dim setting and walk the rest of the way. While I walked, I tried to think up reasons for him being out there. Something definitely would have happened, I have no doubt about it, but the guy was huge. Why didn't he just attack me or rob me right away? Why wait and watch me? The only thing I could think of is if he might have been trying to see if I had a gun or weapon on me. Or he could have just been waiting for me to go to sleep. I got back to my car and drove home. I still go out camping, but it's never been the same since that night. Now I always have that paranoid feeling, like I'm being watched from somewhere that I can't see. Hopefully, it's just a feeling. There was a severe blizzard going on this night. I had actually called off from work just so I didn't have to risk driving there. It was a complete whiteout. I couldn't see more than a couple feet away because the flurry of snow was blocking everything. Anyway, I stayed in all day, and something about the weather made me feel like cozying up on the couch at night and falling asleep while watching TV. I'm not even sure when I actually fell asleep. I think it was somewhat early though, like 8 or 9. I woke up very suddenly to someone coughing. It was just one cough, and I couldn't really tell which direction it came from or how far it was because I was asleep when it happened. Immediately, I noticed how dark it was though, like the whole house was pitch black. I must have been asleep for several hours. But the cough was someone outside my front door this late at night during a blizzard. I got up and looked out. It was still completely white outside. I couldn't see anything. I was really confused though. Had I even really heard something? Or was it one of those weird, real feeling dreams? I turned around to walk back to the couch, but I caught something in the side of my eye, down the hallway, like something moving. I flicked on the light. I stared down the hallway for a moment.
Is someone in here?
I nervously spoke. I felt adrenaline building up in me. I still wasn't sure what I saw, but I felt trapped. I couldn't run out into the blizzard. I was stuck inside, maybe with someone else. I quietly walked down the hallway, but before I got to the end, there were several quick thumps, followed by the heavy winds suddenly flying into the house. I turned the corner. The window on the far end of the room was wide open. Someone had just run out. It felt like my body shut down for a second, but I ran up and closed the window, then called the police. Every sign and trace of the intruder was already covered up in the blizzard by the time they arrived. There's no saying who they were or what they were doing in my home.
I told my friends what I'm about to tell you, and they urged me to share it here. It happened back in December, about a week before Christmas. I'm a 32-year-old guy, currently using my GI Bill to go to college in a city in one of the mountain time zone states. I'm so busy with school and work, so I don't have time to go out and socialize often. So I have to rely on a lot of the apps to go on dates. I matched with this really cute girl around my age, and we had a good conversation, and then we scheduled a date. It was at a bar restaurant, not far for either of us to drive, so it was easy. She was very pretty in person, and we got along great. During our conversation, I found out that she worked in a non-cop role at the police station, like a receptionist essentially. I also learned she had a roommate, whom she said was out of town for the holidays. She added that she hated being alone because she had a crazy ex-boyfriend who stalked her. I was a little uneasy at that, and I told her as much. And she said he's harmless, so I kinda let it go. We had a few more drinks, and we were there for about another hour. And at her suggestion, she said that we should go back to her place. We went to her house, and she walked up and just opened the door. She didn't unlock it. It was already open, which I found very odd because she said she had a stalker, that her roommate was gone. She started feeding her cat, and as she was doing that, I saw a bowl of cereal on the kitchen counter. I touched it, and it was still cold, like it hadn't been there for a while. The cereal wasn't soggy either. I asked her whose it was, and she hesitated and said she ate it as a snack before heading to the bar. But it just didn't make sense. Before I could say anything, she just kissed me and put her arms around me seductively and said for me to take her to her room. We started fooling around, and I went to close the curtains, and she told me to leave them open. A few minutes later, maybe 5, we were in bed and my back was to the window, and she let out a huge gasp. A scared gasp. Her eyes were out the window. I turned around and saw someone in a hoodie, and they took off. I heard the steps running on her back deck. I immediately jumped up and ran out to make sure her doors were locked, and of course the front door wasn't. I ran to it and locked it, and right when I did, the door started banging. I went to open it because I was gonna fuck the dude up, or at least try to, and she told me to just go back to bed with her. I screamed at her and asked if she was insane. She told me he does this and goes away. And I asked her, "You know this is your ex?" And she said yeah, and to not worry about it. At this point, he started banging on the side of the house on the other end, and she didn't seem at all scared. Kept trying to get me to go back to her bed. I didn't want to call the cops because for all I know, this dude was a cop, or she'd know the cops that showed up who would take her side. I also couldn't just leave because my car was at the bar, and I was terrified. At this point, I started calling her out for the door not being locked, the serial, and I openly called her a liar. She couldn't come up with any logical answers, and I had no idea what I was into. I shouldn't have done this, but my fight or flight was pretty much kicked in, and I told her, "If this is a robbery or some kind of setup, I promise I'll kill you both." I'm not a hard ass or anything, but my fear told me to let her know that no matter what it was, they'd have a fight on their hands. My thoughts of what were going to happen to me were all over the place. I ordered an Uber off my phone and didn't tell her. I just kept arguing with her and asking her what was going on, hoping to just keep her talking and in the room. I stayed right next to the door so I could leave ASAP. Luckily, I never got my pants off and my jacket and shoes were right by the door, so I was able to get dressed. The Uber showed up, and without saying anything, I just opened the door and ran out there as fast as I could. I looked back at the door, and she was just standing there. It's only been a little over a month, but I honestly have no idea what the fuck I got into. I don't believe the story of just a girl with a crazy ex based off of the factors I told you. It feels like either a robbery or some weird fetishized cuck thing. I don't know. Definitely something I'm very mad at myself for. I mean, I'm a 9-year Navy vet and allowed myself to get into a situation like that. I reported her account on the Uber ride back to the bar. And I told the bartender as well about what happened, just in case they saw her in there ever again. If I remember correctly, this happened in January or February 2024. I was visiting family in southern France and I didn't want to stay at their place, even if they offered, for personal reasons that I won't share here. Note that I visit them quite often and usually last minute, so I would never book the same place. And I would sometimes book a hotel room, which was more expensive but better for me, as I don't necessarily want to socialize with the hosts. Even when I would book Airbnbs, I would always search for flats or studio flats, and not a room in the flat/house where other people live, as I want to be on my own, so this is an important criterion for me. So I booked this Airbnb within walking distance to where my family members stay, and it looks very nice on paper. I think it was marketed as a house or ground floor flat, with access to a yard and a garden. It was probably one of those cheaper options. I don't remember for sure, but I wasn't going there for leisure or planning to have a very nice place for myself, to have enjoyable holidays, if that makes sense, so I really wanted something for convenience and wouldn't pay extra for any kind of luxury. There were not a lot of reviews, but the few ones were pretty positive. So I go to that place with my suitcase, waiting in front of the house. I contact the landlord, who should give me the keys, but he's late. I spent at least 1 hour waiting outside, and I'm trying to be patient, realizing at least the neighborhood is pretty nice and seems safe, even if I need to walk through areas that are slightly dodgy to get there from where my relatives stay. The landlord finally arrives. He seems like a fairly good man and apologizes profusely, saying he was in another town visiting his cousin or friends, and time flew by. First red flag. He says they were drinking and didn't have time to sober up, so he had to speed on the highway on his motorbike while being tipsy or drunk. He stops and asks me half-jokingly not to say that in my review. I get a bit serious and tell him he shouldn't be drinking and driving, but he says he really didn't want to make me wait further. I tell him I won't flag that in my review. Spoiler alert, I will, but I didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. This guy is nice otherwise and seems trustworthy, very chatty and open to socializing, and frankly, I was just happy I could finally get in and drop my stuff. The second red flag is when he tells me I will be living in a small flat adjacent to the bigger house he lives in. but I shouldn't worry because I would have my own place, own bathroom, own kitchen, etc. I didn't like that too much, but I actually think it might be good because I am not super comfortable being on my own in a ground floor accommodation, knowing anyone can get into the yard and access the front door. I guess you could say I'm paranoid. So knowing that someone I quote-unquote know is close by in case something happens gives me a sense of safety. But I was wrong. He shows me around. It all seems okay. It's pretty old, but as I said, I wasn't looking for a luxury stay. The part where I would stay is on a lower level than street level. Not exactly like a basement because there is access to a garden, but I need to walk down a set of stairs outside and get into the flat through the backyard. This shows mostly when I'm in the bedroom, as I see through the windows that it's clearly at a lower level. Next red or rather yellow flag is when he shows me a door close to the bedroom, which is the connecting door between my part and his house. I was kind of expecting that, but thought he might need to at least cross the yard or access through the front door to get into my part of the house. He says his door stays closed and it's locked anyway. Not as a warning for me, not to try to open it, but more like, you'll notice there is the door. It's useless for you. And what's beyond it is not part of what you're renting. We chat a little bit. Too long for my taste, because I was tired and also still annoyed at his lateness, and I wasn't in the mood to socialize. He gives me his phone number because he said the Airbnb chat feature isn't that good, and that it's easier to use WhatsApp, and then he leaves. I start to settle down, open my suitcase, and get changed before leaving to visit the family. I then go back to the place in the evening and decide to have a shower. If I remember correctly, what I'm saying next happened before I took a shower, because I remember locking the bathroom door, which I never do when I know I'm on my own, and I recall being quite anxious when taking the shower. So the biggest red flag before the last drop. I'm sitting on the bed and I hear a knock and someone saying my name. 2 seconds later, before I get the chance to answer, or even understand where the noise comes from, I hear keys turning in a lock and a door opening. As you might have guessed, it's the connecting door next to the bedroom. The guy enters and says he can't find his phone and that he might have left it downstairs. I'm a bit shocked, probably because if he had come 10 minutes later, I would have probably been naked, ready to take a shower or maybe walking around in a towel, since I'm supposedly alone. I know it might sound like I'm just being a pussy, but keep in mind I'm a relatively young woman alone in a house with a man in his 40s or 50s who has control over when he can get into my place at any time. I stay polite and try to tell him that no, I haven't seen his phone. I would have noticed, there's literally nothing except my open suitcase on a couch in the bedroom. He still gets in, speaking a lot, and it's very fast while I'm sitting there, not fully realizing what's happening and not having a chance to tell him to leave. He looks around the flat and obviously doesn't find the phone. Then he says sorry and probably asks if everything is fine, if I had dinner or something like that, and then he leaves again. At that point, I'm really wondering if I should stay or not, since I know you get refunded only if you cancel 2 nights in advance. I just thought I would lose the money for the night that has already started because it was already after 11 p.m. and the following one, knowing I had booked at least 4 nights. I really needed to take a shower, but questioning if I should, I tried to see if there were available hotel rooms, but it was already too late to book one, or they were already fully booked. I decided to take my shower real quick, wondering if he could hear the shower and deciding that he forgot something else to get in again. Nothing bad happens. I then go back to the bedroom, get dressed as fast as I can just in case, sit down and think. I decide that I will just stay for the night, and I'll probably be less paranoid in the morning if I'm still alive. That's when I notice the chairs in the bedroom. There are 2, and one of them has ropes tied around the armrests. The chairs are in good shape, and the rope is definitely not there to keep the armrests fixed to the chair, as they are just loose. To this day, I have no idea why they were there. I still decide I should sleep there for the night, and try to use a chair to block the door handle in the bedroom, like in the movies. But guys, this only works in the movies. I try with both chairs, trying to pile them up. Even trying to use the ropes one way or another, the handle can still go down enough to open the door easily. I think that at least if I leave them in front of the door, I'll hear if someone tries to open it. But the door opens the other way, and in any case, I didn't know what I'd do even if the noise woke me up. Again, I'm clearly paranoid and anxious, but living alone abroad, my motto is to never ever take risks for my own safety, as I'm usually the only one who can save myself, so it's better to avoid any tricky situation. Doesn't mean I never go out, but I wouldn't get drunk around people I don't trust, and I would take a cab if I feel unsafe going home on my own after midnight. I now live in a city that's rather safe, but has had too many bad encounters. Unfortunately, nothing unusual for most women, not to be careful. So from an external point of view, this is a story about someone booking an Airbnb with good reviews, with a nice and friendly landlord who is just overly open because he likes to meet people, and the ropes are just a detail. But for my anxious and paranoid self, it's the premise for a horror story or thriller, where you shout out the stupid and trusting victim to get away ASAP before the guy comes back. So I decided to call my brother, who came to pick me up around midnight, for me to spend the rest of my stay at his place. I work in food service, front of house, so in the early days of the pandemic, with the restaurants being closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people. So I jumped at the opportunity right away. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest that I had been offered thus far, COVID-wise. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could, due to crowds, so I decided to swing for a rideshare app. I headed in at almost 3 a.m. because it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious though, because I was exhausted. I stumbled onto the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up asking, "Uber?" While I cluelessly wandered up and down the street searching. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not familiar with all the surrounding areas, and I thought nothing of it. I was pretty alert at first, so I was trying to pass the time by playing games on my phone and stuff. But the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one, so I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down into airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. I don't often take rideshares, so being alone with a strange driver often put me a bit on edge, but this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother even. Young, clean kept, listening to jazz. Nothing that screamed, you know. You need to micromanage this trip. When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep and I couldn't fully distinguish it from my dream. Finally, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, Ma'am, we're here now." I was embarrassed that I'd been that out of it, so I just gave a hurried thanks. I booked it out of the car and into the building. As I looked around, I began to realize nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it had appeared to be a strip mall plaza. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. I expected some lights to be off in the nighttime, but not the whole building. I skittered across the concrete foundation, compromising what was left of the lobby area. I told myself they must be renovating, and I followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages, but was probably just a few minutes, all I had passed was construction equipment, a couple of locked doors, and some smashed windows. I was certain I was not going to find a medical office, and figured maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my text that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I enter the correct address, then it was only fair he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling a second trip, considering this was all his mix-up. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so it would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit this situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was just a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help me get from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night, and I didn't have enough reception to call a new ride, but the message wasn't sending. I Reception was too weak. So I gave up on getting my phone going and I started checking for another stairwell, or even a window with balconies, or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort, in the event whoever was downstairs came upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stair sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated, and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured based on my walkabout that the floor was basically a giant loop, so I'd have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of where they were going, and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but I didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I trespassed and become hostile towards me, or even have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds, and the person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So I came out from the beam I was hidden behind, and I started to wave him down. But then I processed. There was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward, and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he must have returned. But in that moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes, operating solely on muscle memory and instinct. I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was too dark to tell. I was disorientated from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, there's another one of these guys. Ugh. And I stumbled backward, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, a voice called out. Alright, this is the police department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air. I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a fight-or-flight mode, and I had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, Hey, I sat on the ground, right now. Hands out. Hands out where I can see them. He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did exactly as he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see that he was actually a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what just happened and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into me being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He was even asking easy questions like, Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke me? Would you rather talk in here or outside? And my total stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car, with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. The first thing I could think of was, Did my friends call you? What did they tell you? And he explained no, nobody called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned. And nobody's supposed to be inside, and when they are, they're not up to no good. He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, he had resources he could direct me to, and this was not an ideal place to do either of those things, and asking if I had somewhere safe to stay that night. But I was stuck on something else he'd said. Finally it all clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story into a frantic word vomit. He looked around and the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details I remembered and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much, but the other officer realized I could pull up my Uber app and I could get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception in there, even outdoors, so we sped down the road. And once I had enough bars, the app roared to life, and I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. They said, "Hello, I've arrived, and I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" And I'm flashing my hazards. And finally, unfortunately, your driver had to cancel. At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off. But instead, I checked the car details, checked again, and it was definitely not the same driver. The person who driven me there had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for the guy, but the best I could give them to go off was basically young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, goatee, and 4-door sedan, wearing a zip-up sweatshirt. Maybe he had a hood, which is like 1 out of every 4 guys in the city. I feel so blessed to have survived this near miss. Suffice to say, I do not take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver's name. You just never know. About 2 weeks ago, I booked an Airbnb in another country. I was going there for a concert. The room was cheap, so I knew I wasn't going to stay in a 5-star hotel, but it was only for 1 night, so I didn't mind as long as I had a bed. To start off, it already wasn't a great trip because my data roaming apparently didn't work in that country at all. I logged into a cafe Wi-Fi and planned my route in advance as best as I could. Managed to be at the house in time, rang the only bell and waited. Nobody came out. I repeatedly rang it and waited for 5 minutes. I noticed the door had a slot for mail and looked through it. I was shocked to see an entrance that looked like an abandoned barn. A super dusty couch right in front of the door, pieces of furniture covered in cloth, very dirty and extremely old. I usually love old houses, but that just didn't look like a house that was in use or prepared for guests at all. I wondered if I was at the wrong house and what to do now, as a super old, unwashed looking guy walked towards the door from the street. I asked him if he knew where the Airbnb was. He mumbled something, which I interpreted as positive. So I asked him if he was Tim, my host. He said yes and opened the door for me. Well, I already described the entrance. The centerpiece was definitely the super old, creaky staircase that led to the upper part of the house. I followed him upstairs. He was heaving and coughing and stinking of cigarettes, which wasn't exactly pleasant, but alright. The second floor was also abandoned looking, super dark with clustered furniture hung with cloth and randomly thrown together, and a super creepy curtain that I couldn't catch a glimpse behind. Another stair up, and we're in my hallway, which was honestly the worst one. Cracks in the walls, old rule paintings, and crosses hung up next to them. It seriously looked like the set of a horror movie. I usually don't have a problem with decor like that. I'm kind of goth, so anything darkly inclined is my jam, but everything looked so badly taken care of that I got major creepo vibes from this house. He showed me the bathroom, which had a huge hole missing in the bathtub tiling and the wall. Everything looked super dirty. He showed me to my bedroom, which was honestly okay. There were just a lot of creepy dolls on the shelves that threw me off, but the bed seemed fine. I asked him if they had Wi-Fi and he said no, which really sucked. I really hoped they would have, because that meant I would have no way to communicate in there. I also asked him when checkout was the next day. He then said it doesn't matter. He then dragged himself up to the 4th story, which was in complete pitch black darkness by the way, so that gave me very weird vibes. I definitely didn't want to get into the shower, so I just quickly changed and charged my phone. When I went to the bathroom, I realized that I didn't even notice the creepiest part. There were no locks at all. Not for the bathroom and not for my room. I also noticed that there were so many half-used items that someone who looked like the guest before me had left there, like shower gels, toothbrushes, and toothpaste. A random lash curler just lay abandoned on the shelf. Not like a here you go for your use in case you forgot yours way, but it just looked like someone left it and nobody bothered to clean it. I already made my mind up that I would definitely not stay the night in this house. My mind was just spinning scenarios. What if all these products were left by the people before me? And why did nobody leave horrendous reviews? I was super spooked. I seriously debated if I should take all my shit to the concert, because it didn't feel safe in the slightest. But my back was really hurting from my heavy backpack, so I just took my essentials and left the room as soon as I could. Not without sliding a folded paper under the door, so I'd see if someone tried to open it in my absence. When I was coming down the staircase, I heard someone turning a key in the front door. I was a bit confused, but in the advert, it said that a couple lived there, so I expected to see the wife or girlfriend of the guy I'd already met. Instead, a middle-aged man enters and says, "Hey, I'm Tim." All I could think of, then who the fuck is the other guy? I was shitting myself inside, but I had brief small talk with him, and finally left the house. I was shook. Luckily I made it in time to the venue, and the concert was worth it. Afterwards, I was so tired that I knew I couldn't stay awake for the whole night, so I checked into a hostel. That was also not perfectly clean, but at least they had Wi-Fi, a proper shower, and a door that had a lock. The next day I got thrown out at 10 a.m, so I made my way to get the rest of my stuff. I don't know why, but I checked the mail slot again and jumped back. The old guy was just snoring on the couch directly in front of the entrance door. I tried my best not to wake him up and snuck into my room to get my stuff. The door hadn't been opened, thankfully, and I finally left this godforsaken place. I don't know if I overreacted, but honestly, from the 2 Tims to the missing locks and a checkout that didn't matter, if I assumed the worst, this would have been the perfect setup to assault or murder someone. In the best case scenario, nothing would have happened, but I probably would have had panic attacks all night. Usually I love solo traveling, but this was just too much.
A couple of years ago, my friends Alex, Drew, and I were having a sleepover during one of the last weekends of summer break. We'd been friends since middle school, and nights like this always felt like a tradition. Staying up late, eating junk food, and watching movies we'd seen a million times. Around 11:30, Drew suggested we sneak out and walk to the park a few blocks away. I lived in a small, quiet neighborhood where nothing ever really happened, so it felt harmless. None of us wanted the summer to end on a boring note, so we agreed. By midnight, we were walking down the road, laughing and joking, keeping our voices low but not low enough. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional sound of cicadas filled the air. The park was about a 10-minute walk, and nothing about the trip there felt unusual. We spent about 45 minutes at the park, messing around on the swings and talking about everything: school, crushes, whatever came to mind. It was just a typical summer night. When we decided to head back home, it was close to 1 a.m. The walk back started off normal. The streets were completely empty, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. As we turned onto a long, narrow road lined with trees, we noticed headlights up ahead. A car was parked at the far end of the street, idling near a stop sign. At first, we didn't think much of it, but as we got closer, the car didn't move. It just sat there. No one else was around, and no other cars were passing through. Alex joked that maybe someone was lost or waiting for directions, but something about it felt off. As we walked past the car, we glanced at it, trying to act casual. It was an old black sedan, the kind that looked like it belonged in a bad 80s movie. The windows were tinted, so we couldn't see inside. That's when Drew whispered that they were watching us. "What?" I asked. Drew said he saw someone move in the driver's seat. We kept walking, trying to act like we didn't notice anything, but my heart was pounding. Then, out of nowhere, the car's engine revved, and it started creeping forward. Alex laughed nervously and said that they were probably just leaving, but they weren't. The car slowly rolled down the road, keeping a distance of about 20 feet behind us. We all agreed that this was pretty weird, but I said we should just keep walking and stay calm. We picked up our pace, but so did the car. It wasn't speeding, just moving fast enough to match us. When we reached the next intersection, we turned onto a side street, hoping the car would keep going straight. It didn't. The car turned onto the side street with us, and this time, it sped up. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted, sprinting down the street as fast as we could. The car's tires screeched as it picked up speed behind us. Adrenaline kicked in, and I felt my lungs burning as we ran. Up ahead, there was a narrow alley between two houses. Without thinking, I yelled at my friends to follow me and darted into the alley. Alex and Drew followed, and we pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the alley. I held my breath, listening as the engine idled. A door slammed, then another. Footsteps. Someone muttered something I couldn't make out, but it was low and angry. Drew grabbed my arm, his grip shaking. I could hear Alex trying to stifle his breathing. The footsteps got louder as the men approached the alley. One of them shined a flashlight, sweeping it back and forth across the walls. "Come on out," one of them called. His voice was rough, like he was used to giving orders. "We just want to talk." None of us moved. The flashlight beam passed over us but didn't stop. The man grunted, and I heard him mutter, "They couldn't have gone far." "Let's check the other side," the second man said. Their footsteps retreated, and I felt a wave of relief, but I didn't dare move yet. We stayed pressed against the wall, waiting, listening. After a few minutes, the car's engine revved again, and I peeked around the corner. The sedan was backing out of the alley, its headlights sweeping across the street. It turned around and sped off in the opposite direction. We waited another few minutes, just to be sure, before sneaking out of the alley. None of us said a word as we made our way back to Drew's house, sticking to the shadows and glancing over our shoulders every few seconds. When we finally got back, we locked the door behind us and collapsed onto the couch. The rest of the night was quiet, but none of us could sleep. The next morning, we saw a post on a local community page. Someone had reported a black sedan driving suspiciously around the neighborhood late at night. The police were looking into it, but nothing ever came of it. I still think about that night sometimes, about how close those men came to finding us, about what might have happened if they had. We were just 3 kids looking for some harmless fun, but we got a reminder that not everything out there is harmless, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. My friends and I like to explore abandoned houses. It's always after school during the day, as the houses often have people squatting in them that come home at night after panhandling all day. Eventually, though, we got bored of houses and wanted to go bigger. Around that time, I was also the first in our group to get a car, so our area of exploration had just increased exponentially. We'd always talk about this one spot at the edge of town, the old, abandoned hospital. A long time ago, when the town was first built, that hospital was the center for all major medical needs. Since then, however, it became ancient and was replaced by modern emergency rooms and mental hospitals, so it was condemned. It sat in a part of town nobody wanted to develop anymore, though, so it was never demolished. This being our biggest target yet, we were more worried about getting caught, so we decided to go there in the middle of the night. We all snuck out after our parents went to sleep, then I went out to my car and drove around to pick up all my friends. Once we were all together, I took us to where the hospital was rotting at the edge of civilization. It was easy to get in. We just walked right through the front door. The whole place smelled like mildew and moisture. There was water damage and mold everywhere, and of course, in a lot of areas, the building was falling apart. The false ceilings were coming down, and the windows were broken, and the walls were full of holes. Nothing we weren't used to, but the fact that it was a hospital and the only lighting we had was the flashlights we brought with us made it even more eerie. Pretty much everything had been removed, so it was just barren hallway after hallway, leading to empty room after room. Only the signs on the walls told us where we were: the trauma ward, the ICU, the burn unit, and everything else in a normal hospital. At some point, I realized that the existence of squatters had completely slipped my mind until then. In all respects, many areas of the building were perfectly suited for it, but I didn't find a single piece of evidence that anyone had ever spent the night there since it closed down. The fact that not even the homeless and desperate wanted to be there was deeply unnerving. I didn't mention it to my friends though. We were all creeped out enough. After what must have been an hour, we had searched just about every inch of the place except for one department, the psych ward on the top floor. It was sectioned off from the rest of the hospital by a set of huge double doors. We all knew this was the cherry on top of the entire building, but we hesitated to enter it. As the oldest and the one who had taken us all there, I was the go-to guy to lead the charge. The second I pushed open the door, I was smacked in the face by a stench I had never smelled before. It was like every foul odor mixed together and turned up to 11. It hit everyone else too, and we all nearly lost our dinners. The smell wasn't the only thing in there, though. At the end of the hallway, there was a light. Not a bright light, but the only one in the entire building. A dim, yellow glow was coming out of the very last room on the right, and it was flickering slightly, like a fire. I wanted to leave, but my friends forced me to keep going with them. I couldn't abandon them and get away with it, so I had to get the whole thing over with. We pressed forward, slowly and silently, creeping down the hallway. The closer we got, the more overwhelming the stench became. We ignored all the rooms on either side of us and headed straight for the source. Eventually, I could hear the fire crackling. I crept up to the doorway and hesitated again before looking in. My friends whispered at me to look, so I worked up the courage to peek around the corner, and then I saw something I'll never get out of my head. It was an old padded cell, littered with bones of all different sizes. The padding was soaked with blood, urine, and feces, dissolved together and rotten into the most toxic, disgusting filth imaginable. At the center of the room, in a rusty metal drum, was the fire lighting it all up, venting out a hole in the ceiling that had seemingly been clawed out by hand. The sight made me physically recoil and jolt back around the corner. My friends frantically asked me what was in there, but when I turned back, I saw someone behind them, standing just a few feet away. It was as close to an animal or some creature from hell as it was human, with snaggled, decaying teeth protruding from its mouth and scratch marks bleeding all over its body. It was completely hairless, and it looked like its ears had been ripped off. Even the tip of its nose was missing. The second I saw this thing, I screamed at my friends to run. We bolted away and went down the stairwell as fast as we could. After getting dumped out of the emergency exit, we ran all the way to my car, where I wasted no time speeding off. My friends were hysterical and kept asking me what I saw, but every time I tried to explain it, they didn't believe me. All I could do was drop them off and warn them to never go back if they valued their lives. This happened months ago, and since then, I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know what to do. I can't reveal this to the police without admitting that I snuck out and trespassed, but something horrible is happening in that building. It's no mystery to me why there weren't any other squatters. There's a freak living there, stalking the halls, living in its own filth and eating anything that moves, probably even parts of itself. It ate those animals right down to the bone. I can only hope none of those bones were human. When I was growing up, me and my brother Carter spent a week at our grandparents' farm every summer. It was one of those farms in the middle of nowhere, with endless fields of corn and a rickety old barn filled with hay. I was 11 and Carter was 13, which meant he was always trying to act tough. Our grandparents were old school and believed strongly in hard work and an early bedtime. The first few days were kind of fun. We explored the farm and jumped around in the piles of hay in the barn, but boredom hit hard by midweek. That's when Carter got the idea to sneak out at night and walk to the gas station a couple of miles down the road to grab snacks. It was a dumb idea, and I knew it. Grandpa had told us not to wander off the property after dark, but Carter had that nothing bad ever happens attitude that always got us into trouble. And, like an idiot, I went along with it. We waited until the house was quiet, and we were sure our grandparents were asleep. Carter grabbed a flashlight, and we slipped out the back door, careful not to let it bang shut. The cool night air hit me, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But Carter was already heading down the dirt path, so I followed. The moon was bright enough to fill up the fields on either side of the path. Rows of corn stretched endlessly, their tall stalks swaying in the breeze. About halfway down the road, we passed one of Grandpa's scarecrows. It stood in the middle of the cornfield, backlit by the moon, its burlap sack head and straw-stuffed body casting a shadow over the path. It looked like it had fallen off the cross it hung on and was balancing on its feet. I said it looked kinda creepy, and Carter laughed at me. He said he wasn't scared of a stupid scarecrow. A little farther down, Carter froze, and I bumped into him. I called him a jerk, but he didn't respond. He pointed toward another scarecrow, but this one wasn't like the others. It was shorter, more squat, and there was someone standing next to it. At first, I thought it was Grandpa, maybe checking on the fields, but I realized it wasn't him. It was a woman. She was old, with gray, greasy hair that clung to her face. She wore a tattered dress that looked like it hadn't been washed in decades. Her back was to us, and she was muttering something under her breath. Her hands were on the scarecrow, stroking its burlap head like it was alive. My legs went weak. I begged my brother to turn back. Carter didn't move. He stared at the woman, his jaw clenched. He told me to stop being such a scaredy cat and that he was going to get snacks no matter what. He took one step forward, and the woman suddenly stopped muttering. Her head tilted slightly, like she'd heard us. I held my breath, hoping she'd stay focused on the scarecrow. But then, her head snapped towards us. Her face was pale and wrinkled, her eyes sunken and dark. Her mouth twisted into a wide smile, showing gums where her teeth should have been. She let out a cackling laugh that made my stomach drop. Then, she started running at us. Carter let out a high-pitched scream and spun around. We bolted down the path, the flashlight bouncing wildly in Carter's hand. I could hear her footsteps behind us, the sound of bare feet slapping against dirt. I didn't dare look back. My chest burned and my legs felt like jelly, but fear kept me moving. We reached the house, and Carter fumbled with the back door. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the handle. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see her right behind us, but when I finally looked, she wasn't there. The fields were empty. Carter yanked the door open, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. We stood there, gasping for air, listening for any sign of her outside. But all we could hear was the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Our grandpa came down in his robe. He was pissed at us for sneaking out, so we didn't tell him about the woman. After a thorough talking to, he sent us to bed. Me and Carter lay in our beds, covered up to our chins, thankful to be back inside the safe, locked house. I thought the scary part of the night was over, but then I heard a tapping at the window. I felt the breath get sucked out of my chest. Me and Carter both sat up and looked at each other. We glanced at the window. It was covered with a long red curtain, but there looked to be the shadow of movement behind it. The tapping continued. Carter slipped out of his bed. I hissed at him to get away from the window, but he ignored me. He crept toward it, his hand reached out. Carter yanked back the curtain. Moonlight spilled in the room, and I saw something that still terrifies me to this day. The woman stood at the window. Her nose pressed against the glass, and beside her was a scarecrow. Only, it wasn't a scarecrow at all, but a dirty man wearing the clothes off of one of my grandpa's scarecrows. He tapped a grimy finger against the glass, grinning wide. To my horror, I realized that the scarecrow me and Carter had seen standing on its feet was the man in front of us. He'd been watching us. Carter and I both screamed. The two freaks began to cackle. Me and Carter ran to my grandparents' bedroom, but by the time we all got back, they were gone. Me and Carter finally told our grandpa the whole truth. He was understandably upset, but more focused on finding out who those weirdos were. My grandma called the cops while my grandpa talked to us, and they came and looked the whole farm over. They didn't find the old people. The only thing out of order on the farm was one of my grandpa's scarecrows tossed to the ground with its clothes ripped off. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every time I visit Grandpa's farm, I find myself glancing at the scarecrows, half expecting it to turn into that man and for the woman to appear beside him. I don't know who they were or why they were out there, but one thing's for sure. I'll never walk down that path at night again.